Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, we've got Father Adam Streitenberger. He is the executive director of the St. Thomas More Newman Center at Ohio State University. So he's responsible for converting the entire Ohio State University campus, students, faculty, and everybody else. Um, and he's just a young priest. He's 45 years old, and he is seeing an unbelievable resurgence. He was the director of evangelism in Columbus, and so he's up there doing a good job. And so, Father, tell us what you're seeing up there with these students.
Well, I get to say I get to witness the Lord working in the lives of these
Oh,
young
wait a
men.
minute, Father, before you go, a deum qui laetificat uventutem meum.
Ah,
How is that?
I like it. I like it.
Yeah, I
You must have
first
been a
uttered
really
those
good
words
altar
when
boy.
I first uttered those words when I was in the fourth grade and decided I wanted to be an altar boy. I think mostly because I didn't like just sitting there in church. I thought there was something I could do more than that. And so anyway, in the fourth grade, I became this altar boy. And then around the 10th grade, the noon commentator didn't show up, and the priest asked me to he asked me to go down and put my jacket on and kind of lead the people. And people don't know what a commentator is, but you do. And so at the age of, I don't know, 15 or 16, I started doing that. And you can imagine the profound impact it had on my life. But anyway, I want to go back to Ohio State. And it's not just Ohio State, it's all over the country. What is going on with these kids just flocking to your place?
Yeah, well, I'll preface everything I say with two things. First of all, is each one of their stories is unique, and second is ultimately, we have to attribute this to the Lord and to the work of the Holy Spirit, both at OSU, but around the country. But with that said, I've kind of reflected on this, and of course, I'm meeting with students one on one throughout the day, throughout the whole academic year. So, I get a pretty good perspective. And one of the things that I've kind of seen a common theme is a lot of these young men and women come from a background that really, I would say, institutions have failed them. So over 50% of college age students now come from a divorced background. So their parents were divorced. It's probably close to 60%. So they've seen that marriage has failed them. Maybe in some cases their parents have failed them. I think although I kind of avoid the conversations on politics, I think that a lot of these young men and women see that maybe the political system and the political parties have in some ways failed them. Um, and it's an interesting thing, so that you think, well, why would they go to the most institutional organization in, Western civilization, the Catholic Church? Well, I think they've reached a point where actually they recognize something that I don't think people my age recognize, and that is that every institution made of human beings is in some ways going to let you down. And I think what they've turned to is, you know what? Let's retry Catholicism. And a lot of these young men and women that I've talked to, their parents stopped practicing the Catholic faith when the pedophilia crisis hit in the early 2000s. And so they're giving it another shot because I think they have come to a realization that, you know what? Um, every human being in some way is going to let us down. But what we do need is a foundation, and we need a tradition. And so they're going to, I think, the most stable tradition in Western civilization, and looking for that. And you think about it, every moment is changing in their life. Social media is constantly evolving and changing. Their language is constantly evolving and changing. Every day there's some new phrase that they're using. And I think they want stability, and I think that's what Catholicism in particular offers them.
So, do they come in to see you? Do they ask for an appointment? How does it work?
Yeah, well, I have a Calendly link, which is kind of it's I think it's very brave. So they can come up and sign up for an appointment. I have hours, and we do half-hour blocks of one-on-one. And sometimes they're coming in to talk about a breakup. Sometimes they want to talk about switching their major. Sometimes they want to talk about kind of questions about the faith, maybe especially as they're studying here at The Ohio State University. There's some challenging topics that they need to deal with. And then, a lot of them are searching, and not only are these kind of practicing Catholics that'll pop in and see me, but I see a lot of students. Like one student popped in that wanted to meet with me, and she said, this is going to be kind of odd, but I have no religion. And I just wanted to kind of talk to someone who could maybe help me process what I'm going through. So I think it's really amazing what's happening in the lives of these young men and women, these college age students. I think there's a depth to them, and they're looking for something more, which I think should make us all really excited.
Oh yeah. So in other words, well, give me a typical kind of meeting. Maybe there isn't a typical kind of meeting without
Yeah.
betraying. I mean, you obviously aren't going to betray any confidences.
Yeah, yeah.
But what's it like? Give me like a
Yeah.
couple examples.
So, so
They
I'll
say
have,
who? Go ahead.
yeah, I'll have a lot of men and women come in who are like, they'll first kind of preface the whole statements and with their story and say like, I was baptized a Catholic, but my parents stopped practicing after I was about 3 or 4. Or they'll say, I was raised in an evangelical church, a non-denominational Protestant church. Um, or, like we had absolutely no religion. So they always kind of start with this background.
Right.
And then they'll always have, well, I just realized that you know, I needed something more, or I needed a tradition by which to kind of help me live this life. An interesting kind of category of young people that I run into are men who are really looking to see how to be men. And I think that's the thing that I've been that kind of has
What does
struck
that
me
mean?
in the last
What does
couple of
that mean, Father?
Well, I think they look at the culture and they see sort of a toxicity in masculinity. And certainly I think the women in their lives see a certain toxicity in masculinity in our culture. And they really don't know how to be good men and how to live masculinity in a virtuous way.
I'm sort of not understanding that. What do you mean by that? A crisis of masculinity? What does that mean for a young man
Yeah.
who's
Yeah, well,
18, 19 years old?
yeah, I mean, I think to go right into it, I think first of all, the culture of pornography,
Hmm.
chronic pornography is, I mean, you know, maybe, these kind of struggles have always been a part of the human condition, at least since the fall, but it's certainly escalated with the internet and with social media. And so they view women really as
Oh, they're
objects
not. I
for their
gotcha.
pleasure.
As yeah. So in other words, they're not being good. They're not being honorable men.
Well, and
Yes, I
and I
see what
and
you're
I
saying.
don't think
Yeah.
it's just that either. I
Yeah.
think, because of this culture, there is a certain feminization of masculinity.
Hmm.
Like in order for you to be a good man, you actually should act more like a woman. And
Huh.
so then, of course, that brings up the whole issue of gender roles and gender identity, which is, um,
You hear about that too.
which
Well, can
I
you?
think,
Okay, these are complicated subjects, and you
yeah,
give them
yeah.
and you give them a half an hour. I mean, it takes me a half an hour to clear my throat. I mean,
Well,
is
I am kind of notorious for running about 15 minutes over on my
okay.
appointments.
So you
So,
give them about 45 minutes, and do they ever say, "Well, I'd like to come back"? Do you have a string of people who come back?
oh yeah, yeah. A lot of these people, and I think this is the interesting thing is they're educating themselves. So they're not coming to me fresh, with these ideas. They're hitting YouTube, they're hitting the internet, they're hitting podcasts. Most of and I would say especially evangelical Protestants who are becoming Catholic, come in having really, fully researched the topic. They've researched the background of Catholicism, and when they come to me, it's really simple work because they've done their research, and so I give a little explanation, and then what they do, then I kind of direct them to our staff to walk with them as they start the journey.
Well, why would an evangelical Protestant, let's not go extreme, but a typical evangelical,
Hmm.
why would they be unhappy and think they can find a home in the Catholic Church?
That's a really good question.
I mean, what are
I
they not getting in their?
Yeah, well, I think in some cases, um, in um, in some non-denominational churches and congregations,
Right.
I think it's a little maybe not as deep that they're looking for. They're looking for a little more theological depth. I
Huh.
think I think in some ways they're looking for more clarity on moral issues. Um, I think one of the things that I think I would attribute the growth in Catholicism this year and the last couple of years is we really Catholicism really in America has really been focusing on um, a and it's really at the heart of the Catholic tradition, but focus on the gospel and a personal relationship with Christ and living that in the Catholic life. And so evangelicals see that I can still really be an evangelical and live a full Catholic life
Hmm.
with the tradition behind it. And I think that's another thing is the tradition. I mean, I think a lot of Protestant groups have gone more to contemporary music. I think
Yeah.
a lot of these young men and women are looking for an ageless tradition, you know?
Yeah. Let me ask you about that. It's been interesting. I have a number of questions here that just pop into my head here. Why do you think they're looking for the most conservative Catholic approaches? You in New York, you see them, going through uh, going through areas of New York City with rosaries. You see women doing it. You see men, doing hosting pizza parties. But the churches themselves, some of them are doing Latin, which I assume these young people don't know. I mean, maybe they do, and that's really would be pretty amazing. But it seems to be trending towards a much more conservative uh, Catholic tradition. I don't quite get that. Why is that?
Well, I would say a couple things. First of all, traditional in the sense that they're trending to a more traditional Catholicism because, and I would count, people my age in this group, young and younger, all the way down to these college students, is we really in the church, in the Catholic Church, especially maybe in parts of America, we're deprived really of that rich tradition. There was a pendulum switch or a shift with the liturgy and with a lot of other things that really deprived a generation of Catholics from some of these things that really help you pursue the Lord and live the life. So I think they're hungry for tradition. I think if we want to use the word conservative in the sense of orthodox, that they believe everything that the church proposes. I think this simple fact that really applies to anyone alive right now in America, and that is, if you're going to believe in God and you're going to be a part of a religion, then you better take it seriously and buy it, entirely. Because this sort of wishy-washy, almost hypocrisy, it can't stand in the face, I think, of the secular culture that we're in. If you believe in Catholicism, then live it completely. I think
Well,
that's
what would you say those Catholic traditions are?
that they embrace. I mean, I think
Yeah.
well, I think certainly within the liturgy, they like the use of Latin, generally speaking. They like not the entire Mass in Latin, but certain parts. I think they prefer either chant or more traditional hymnody. They like the tabernacle with the Blessed Sacrament to be in the center. One thing that's very huge here at The Ohio State University is adoration of the Blessed Sacrament. So the Eucharist is exposed on the altar, and you have time to pray throughout the day. I mean, when we do this, which we do from about 8 a.m. to 5:30 p.m. Monday through Friday during the school year, we'll have a dozen students at any given time praying in the chapel.
Hmm.
Silence is one thing, and I would say that kind of goes even beyond the tradition. It's one of the basic things that we're looking for. I know Protestants and committed Protestants here at Ohio State University who will come into our chapel and pray during adoration because it's the only place on campus that's silent, that you can just sit there,
Right.
pray or think or whatever you want to do.
Let me ask you about this. What goes through my mind is the issue of faith and counseling. In other words, okay, so I'm pursuing something because, I've had a disrupted childhood or things aren't working out for me. I wanted to have this major. I went to school. I'm making poor grades. My parents are on me. I lost my girlfriend and all that kind of stuff. Um, and I think that's an opportunity, as I say, a window of opportunity for people to explore their faith. But I would also think that some of them are really looking for counseling, and it would be good if you had faith and counseling combined. But we don't want to mistake the pursuit of faith for the need for counseling. Am I right about that?
No, you make a really good point, and I think there's a couple layers. I think first of all is a lot of these young men and women don't have um, people in their lives, especially now that they're separated from home, where they can get good advice that is grounded in the faith. So I think that's one of the things that, you know, um, we offer the sacrament of confession um, about 2 hours a day, every day during the school year, and it's a back-to-back line all day, and that's
Huh.
not the sacrament of confession, as you know, is not a counseling service, but they are bringing their life and kind of wanting the Lord, in a sense, to breathe into it through the sacrament. But I think the counseling stuff is they are looking for a faith perspective because one of the important aspects of this life is discernment. And how do I make the decisions that I need to make based on the will of the Lord for me? And so part of a lot of our conversations is, okay, what's your prayer life like? And what's the Lord doing in that time of prayer to let you know what he wants you to do, what major he wants you to pursue, what job and profession he wants you to pursue? Are you called to marriage, or are you called maybe to the priesthood or to religious life? So there's that, I think, what we would call spiritual direction, which is I think different than counseling. Now, we have here at Buckeye Catholic, we have two
Buckeye
counselors.
Catholic.
Yeah,
Everything's got to be Buckeye. And you even say the Ohio State. I mean,
yeah. Hey,
all
hey,
right. Okay.
you
All
know,
right. I got it.
when in
Uncle.
Rome, when in
Yeah,
Rome.
yeah. Good point.
But we have two counselors who have hours here throughout the day, and,
Ah,
and honestly, part of and they're licensed counselors.
sure. Are
They're
they are they busy?
they are, yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Some they don't just see Ohio State students. They do have some clients from elsewhere, but I always see them in their office through like they're pretty busy. One of the things that that I think a lot of these students find is that secular psychologists, therapists, counselors are not really giving them the kind of advice that's helpful.
Yeah.
And so what we really did is to kind of provide some Christian counselors who can who can deal with their real issues. And I'm not a psychologist. And when I step into a situation where maybe someone is,
Yeah.
is dealing with a certain condition, then I can direct them to someone that can keep walking with them in that area. So,
Father, here's my view about it. If you have a crisis, because that's the time when people will tend to look around and say, what I've been doing isn't working, or, my God, my goodness, I'm in a whirlwind and I just don't know where to go. I think at that point, I think the best counseling is counseling combined with faith. And
mhm,
the reason I say that is that for a person, and I don't quite know how it happens. I think faith is really a gift. I don't think it's something you can't run around the Ohio State University stadium and get faith, but you can ask for it. But some
mhm,
people get it, it's a gift. And, but the idea that you have the being, God, uh, Jesus for that matter, um, that they're on your side, that through thick and thin, they're on your side. And that I'm very struck. There is a man by the name of Helmut Thielicke who's written a book, many books, and he speaks to me about more than anybody. He has a book called Our Heavenly Father, which I've just now directed to my daughters. What Thielicke says is that all things must pass through the hands of God, and that all things ultimately turn out good for those who love God. Now, if you actually believe that, if you actually, and that God will direct whatever is happening in your life, that God will direct what is happening in your life in a way that ultimately will be positive. Boy, what a great thought that is. That
yeah.
nothing happens randomly. And Thielicke made a series of sermons. I don't know if you know his name. He's not a Catholic, but he's an incredible preacher. And he preached during World War II, and bombs are falling in his church, and he's preaching this. And he's saying these bombs that are falling, God's aware of it. And I know this sounds completely crazy to people who don't believe, but somehow, all things work to the good for those who love God at the end. Now, if our young people or anybody could really understand that, even think about it, contemplate it, not dismiss it, and measure it carefully in your life, that gives you a sense of security. Combined with counseling, the real rugged counseling about, my parents got divorced and I don't know what to do and I don't know how these relationships work, or my father or mother was an alcoholic and it's affecting me. You got to have the hard
Yeah.
counseling. But combined with faith can give you an optimism and a hopefulness I sound like I'm preaching here, Father, I
Yeah,
know.
yeah.
But I have to say it because, this is an important part of my life.
No, I really I think what struck me with what you said. So, my father who was a mechanic, um, a great man, great humble man. Now, I think you would have loved him. He may have even voted for you, although he was a straight line Democrat
Well, that's my
and
problem.
a
All the
war boss
Democrats
all of
like
his
me and
life.
not enough Republicans. So I get it, Father.
But he used to always tell us, it'll all work out. It'll all work out. And I really think, my job here at The Ohio State University is to be a spiritual father to these young men and women. And that really is what I have to say to them, is what my dad would say to me. And that it all will work out. And we work through some of these issues, like coming to terms with their parents' divorce, with breakups, is that God God is in control, and He permits
Yeah.
suffering in our life and evil in our life so that He'll bring an infinite good out of it. This is the promise of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, that from death life comes. And from these experiences, the Lord is going to make them into strong men, strong women, maybe better husbands and wives than their parents were, maybe better businessmen than their bosses were that they had over their
Yeah.
internship, whatever it
Yeah.
might be. Um, and I think this is ultimately why there is a revival going on in faith, and I think in the Catholic Church
Yeah.
here at Ohio
But
State.
I would just say, uh, Father, that it does not appear many times that all things are just going to work themselves out, because some things, I would argue to you that some things unfortunately don't work themselves out here. But I think we have to remember that this is just a short span of life. That reminds me of that sermon where the little boy and his mother go to church, and the priest says, from dust we come, to dust we go. And they go home, and the little kid goes upstairs. He comes down, and he sees his mother. And he says, Mom, I looked under my bed, and someone's either coming or going. But the fact of the matter is that we can see horrible things happen. But how does it get resolved? And if we believe that God is a God of love and a God of justice, does this get resolved over time? So we can't,
Um,
I think, to give them a false sense that it's all fine. And in that case, we just need to be in the ditch with them,
Yeah, well, ultimately, I
right?
mean, yeah, ultimately, because we're coming from a faith perspective, we have to remember that we live for something greater, for eternity.
Yeah,
And
that's
as
correct.
you know, as
Yes.
as the Psalms remind us, put not your trust in princes. Like the things of this world are going to pass away. And we're not going to solve these solutions. I think one of the problems in Christianity throughout the world has been our putting our hope in temporal salvation. That somehow, through focusing on social projects, we can create some utopia or heaven here on earth. When in reality, we know that the fulfillment of this, the working of everything out, ultimately is going to be an eternal life, and after the second coming of
Yes. And,
Christ.
and that doesn't mean, though, that while we're here, we can't struggle, or say, maybe struggle has made me, I don't like that word, but it doesn't mean that we don't have a purpose here as we go through the most difficult things. I will tell you, Father, that, and some of this comes, and I've talked about this many times, and I'm not afraid to. My mother and father were killed by a drunk driver, and frankly, it got my attention about what I really believe, who I am, and who God is. And did I even believe in him after having been an altar boy, a commentator, and all that stuff? Forget it. That was a rabbit's foot in my pocket. Okay. But the real depth of faith is something that has to be pursued. And what I would say is, as devastating as that was, it has worked out to the best for me. It's been devastating to members of my family. Uh, and I can't explain all that, but I know that for me, as tough as that was, uh, I got much better. I was at Harvard and spoke about this, to a group of students many years, not that many years ago, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago. No resentment, I mean, and I talk about it all the time. And I think there's something that when you go through trials, you join with other people who've gone through trials. And we can teach people who haven't gone through trials. The trials are coming, right? It's coming. But the beautiful thing about Thilicky is when he does say that random is not the case. God knows, as you said it, God knows what he's doing, God's in control. And I think that's helpful for anybody, but young people in particular to know, right? What
Yeah,
about that football team you had up there? Were they in there with you? Were they hanging out with you at church?
Will Howard, I saw Will Howard a lot when he was here. But most of the other ones, the Ohio State University protects their football players and they
Right.
probably should. So you don't see them around campus a whole lot, but Will would come here quite often.
Well, I mean, there was this story about how they would all pray together
Mhm.
and it held them together and all. What do you know? Can you shed any light on that, or is
Yeah,
that something you really don't
there
know?
was this beautiful, I mean, we interfaced with a few years ago. It was the year of the championship. Um so they a few of the students I think really and I think a few of the alums, the former students who are still kind of in contact with their teammates, they really felt moved by the Lord to put on this prayer event and to really use and leverage their influence as, leaders here at Ohio State. And so they had an event, on campus. Basically, it was a night of prayer, some testimonies that some of the players gave. And it was a very beautiful. I was there. And then this last year they also did it as well. I think it actually is going to become an annual tradition, would be my guess. But they invited all the different Christian groups, so they invited us um, and our different outreach groups that we have to this event, and it was a very beautiful and moving. I think I think it is one factor of um, a real revival at the Ohio State University. I don't know if I would necessarily credit it all to the event.
No, it's
The
certainly
football
not.
players, but
Certainly not. But that
another.
helps.
I'll tell you another thing that I've found here at Ohio State that's very interesting is the Salmon P. Chase Institute that the General Assembly set up a few years ago, and it's basically to ensure intellectual diversity on campus, um, which means everyone gets their perspective, and it also really focuses on civics and being involved in the civic order and kind of good civics, and I think they're really influencing the culture as well.
Yeah, interesting. Um, do, do, I guess when you see those who, first of all, how many come in and stay, and how many people, it's like the seed on the ground, right?
Yeah.
What do you say? What takes root? How would you judge that?
Yeah, I think so we have currently, I think our average is about 1,200 students come to Mass on Sundays. When I started in 2022, it was about 400 a weekend. So we just seen some real steady growth. There were over 70 that came into the church this year. I think To the point that you made earlier about crises, when we face a crisis in our life, it does teach us that first of all, there's someone else in this life that I need to depend on, namely the Lord. And so I find that a lot of students respond to whatever crisis it might be. Some of them are little, some of them are epic. Um, I think there's a certain staying power, I mean, I don't know the percentage, but I think that if we're able to interface with them either say through one-on-one meetings, through the sacrament of confession, or maybe one of our staff members or our missionaries reach out with them, I find that they generously receive this and
Yeah,
respond to it.
that's
I mean, I
good.
do think students who haven't reached a crisis point yet, they might be interested in the faith, but I think those are the ones that maybe don't last
Right,
the
right.
whole.
So I'm going to just take you one other direction, and then I'm going to let you go save more souls. Okay,
Yeah,
Father.
yeah.
It's interesting. I was talking just yesterday on television about Trump's fighting with the Pope, and I made the point that Trump doesn't seem to land any knockout blows, of course, on the Pope. And I attribute it to the fact that when somebody is spiritually driven, they're not subjected to the same pressures. And that's an interesting thing, particularly for our young people to hear. If you are spiritually driven, it doesn't mean that money, power, and influence doesn't affect you, but it's not that money, power, and influence doesn't have the same grip on you that it does when you don't understand that. And it seems to me as though the Pope lives in a spiritual world, and the things that would normally affect any human being, a person who doesn't have that spirituality has a harder time being able to resist the attacks. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the dispute between the president and the Pope, and I wouldn't call it a dispute because I don't think the Pope is really responding to it. I mean, I think that it's interesting because I think, at least from my perspective, I think because Trump, although not as explicitly, which is kind of ironic, is but he did kind of clash with Pope Francis, if we recall.
Yeah,
Um, and I think some of those blows landed generally on Pope Francis more than on Pope Leo, because I think Pope Leo is new and he's an American, and his message really is very not it's very uncontroversial, which is unity. Like that's the message
yeah,
of Pope Leo. And
right.
I mean, what kind of, I mean,
And
how can
peace,
you,
and
and,
peace.
and then ultimately
Yeah,
peace. Yeah, yeah. And
mean,
I think, I mean, the question that I wonder and is um, why President Trump is so, I think, threatened by Pope Leo. Because I think the position that Pope Leo is making is reasonable, and I also think it's a position that a lot of the people in President Trump's party hold to as well. That I mean, and President Trump was, I guess, singing this from this hymn book a few months ago that he wanted, the Nobel Peace Prize, and we want peace. Um, I I don't know. I'm really kind of curious. I don't know if there's you know, kind of a connection to the rise in Catholic conversions this year and last year. If if it's less the Pope is a threat and maybe Catholicism is a threat to the president. I mean, these are highly controversial positions, questions that I throw out, but I'm wondering if it's not, one of the things I see with a lot of students that are turning to Catholicism, and especially as it has been, presented under Pope Francis and Pope Leo, is that you actually can be intensely religious and be nonpartisan.
Oh
Um,
yeah, I mean,
in which your
absolutely.
faith is, in which your
Yeah.
commitment ultimately is to the Lord.
Yeah,
And
not to a political party. Yeah,
yeah,
that's a good. Yeah.
and
Boy,
I
we
think
would be doomed if it wasn't. If it meant that I
yeah, yeah,
believe in God, so therefore I'm a Republican or something, that
yeah.
would be just, oh my,
So
that'd be the worst thing.
I think that's what Pope Francis and Pope Leo have really offered the church in
Yeah,
America. It's like, listen, drop your labels other than the label that you're Catholic or that you're Christian, you know?
yeah.
And um, I'm wondering if that's not a threat to President
Well,
Trump
you know,
and
who knows? But what I do want to say is that, and at the same time, we're very happy about the approach towards Catholicism. I also am really happy that uh, that we, being believers, can believe in the power of faith in both the Jewish community and the Muslim community. We're all, you know, there's one big thing that separates us, but essentially there's a lot that actually combines us and brings us together. And but Father Streitenberger, okay, I hope we can stay in touch.
yeah,
And
I thank you very much for having me on. I love talking about this stuff, and I also want to thank you for all your service to the great state of Ohio.
well, thank you. It was you know, I have to say that being governor, I mean, I look back on it, it was easy. You know, and the reason why it was easy is I essentially knew what I wanted to do.
Yeah.
And the politics and the fighting and all that stuff just didn't really faze me much. And most people would say, well, that had to be hard. No, it was actually pretty easy and thoroughly enjoyable because we had a purpose, we carried it out, we had good principles, and people got helped, and that's what mattered the most. Father, I'll see you at the Newman Center sometime.
Yeah, we would love to have you. Stop on over.
Okay. All
Take care.
right,
God
sir.
bless.
Thanks. God bless.